Let me just introduce Max a bit and give you a sense of where he's from, and then let him speak for himself. He's way better able to do that than I am. Max was born in Haiti and came to the United States. He's a theorist of Pan-Africanism in the broadest possible sense, but a lot of his work has been as an organizer, and an organizer in particular, not restricted to, but in particular around urban kinds of issues, housing, anti-gentrification issues, questions of homelessness, anti-racism, questions of class as well, in all of that, LBGT stuff, and you know, in the housing arena. Max was instrumental in putting together the group called Take Back the Land, which I assume most of you will know about in one way or another. And in that respect, let me just mention the book that Max authored called Take Back the Land, an activist Bible in some places, and deservedly so. Take Back the Land helped to, really did organize putting together the creation of a shantytown in Liberty City in Miami in October 2006, which lasted for about 6 months. A very powerful statement about housing and homelessness and anti-gentrification work. From there, Take Back the Land has moved on to become a movement most centrally involved in taking back housing taken over by the banks, anti-foreclosure kind of political movements. And while it started in Miami, it stretched north to Rochester and has also become a part of the landscape in a whole number of cities: Madison, Wisconsin, Atlanta, DC, Sacramento in California, Boston, and other places. And it's on the basis of that, really, that I think that the movement that Max has initiated is really building. The point of having Max here today is not just to tell us about what they've done in the past, but also really to talk about what they're going to do in the future. And there's a spring offensive that they're organizing right now. What we want to try and do is to help to organize that spring offensive, get people involved, not just intellectually and political support through the fundraiser, to become involved in the politics of that event. And it's very much that I think that Max is here to talk about tonight. So the title that I think Max has given us is Take Back the Land, Building a Movement Through Land and Housing Occupation. So Max Rameau, thank you very much. Thank you.
So thank you very much, and I'm very grateful to be here for a number of reasons, not the least of which I'm a big fan of Dean Smith's work. But I'm also just very appreciative to get a chance to talk about some of what we're doing and talk with each of you about that. So we're going to break this up in a couple of parts and talk about a couple different things. One is just what we think the crisis is, and what, therefore, that the opportunity that this crisis represents. And then second, talk a little bit about the whole connection between the occupied stuff and the work that Take Back the Land does. And then finally, switch gears significantly and talk about, not significantly, but in one way, talk about what our broader vision for the social justice movement is during this particular time, which we haven't done yet in this format. We've done it in very, very small groups, but haven't done it in this format yet. But I'm interested in putting that out there a little bit. So we are now in a complete and total economic crisis, which is extremely severe, the most severe that we've seen here in at least a generation, probably a few generations. And it's impacting people across race and class. Although to be perfectly clear, it is disproportionately impacting low-income Black women. That's what we think is at the center of this in terms of what the crisis is, and therefore what the response to the crisis has to be. It does disproportionately impact low-income Black women. However, because for the first time in recent memory, we have a crisis which is impacting significant numbers of whites and former middle-class whites, there's a lot of energy being put behind addressing this crisis in one shape or form. And that presents for us an incredible opportunity. The crisis here is forcing people, because all the things around them that we're used to seeing me stand up and stand so well over time seem to be falling down. It's forcing people to rethink certain aspects of the significant number of paradigms of their society, of their world, of what they thought was true. So they are running, I think, because of this crisis, to two separate kind of extremes on one side or the other. So some of the group are running towards demonstrating far greater compassion for the fellow human being and questioning what the role of corporations are and things like that in our society. Others are running in the exact opposite direction. Extreme xenophobia, blaming the poor, and showing no sympathy for the poor and their plight whatsoever. So these are two extremes that people are running to. The fact that people run to these two extremes speaks to what I think crisis does to people. And that is, it forces them to rethink their world, rethink the paradigms, the paradigms around it. A few years ago, very few people questioned a system that allowed someone to get a $200,000 mortgage for a house that was worth $100,000 because everybody thought they were going to be able to resell the house in 6 months for $300,000. Nobody complains about a Ponzi scheme while it's still making payouts. You only complain about it when it's on the way down, when people are owed money. And that's really where it is. So for better or for worse, the housing boom crashed, turned into a bust. And now, as a result of the bust, people are questioning the system that created the bust and ultimately created the boom as well. So this new willingness that people have, this large number of people right now have, to rethink significant parts of the way they think the world works, the significant parts of the society, presents the social justice movement with an incredible, potentially unprecedented opportunity to insert into the debate a vision of what the world could potentially look like. People are saying this way doesn't work, and now we have an opportunity to get in and say, we have an idea about how it could work, and present that vision, and then meaningfully engage and struggle to realize that vision. I don't think that was true 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We could not, even if we had the opportunity to present those views, they would not have been taken seriously for the most part. And we would not have a chance to meaningfully struggle to achieve some of those visions. And people affiliated with Take Back the Land, and now I suspect people affiliated with Occupy Wall Street and other Occupies are now, and have been for a couple of years, at least with Take Back the Land, going around and speaking, and people are coming out to hear. 10 years ago, no one would come out to hear someone talking about breaking into houses. That just would not have happened. It's not something that was in the realm of possibilities. And now it's something that's really meaningful. People are organizing around. Even mainstream organizations are starting to think about it and organizing. So if this crisis is as bad as it appears, and I think it is, the idea that people rethink major issues and major paradigms in the midst of a crisis, then we're about to enter an era in which we can have the potential for significant transformation of the way the society works. So the idea that this crisis is forcing people to rethink things, and the rethinking things is going to then result in some different way that the society works, goes to the heart of ideas about how societies are transformed, how they evolve, how they revolve effectively. So the theory of transformation that we operate from, which is really firmly rooted in dialectical materialism, is that every society, not even society abroad, every organism, every social organism, has contradictions and has conflicts, and those contradictions and conflicts sometimes rise to the level of crisis. And when they rise to the level of crisis, in response to that crisis, the crisis means that things are not working and people have to rethink things. In response to that crisis, people or forces in the society present competing ideas about how to resolve the crisis. And then those competing ideas fight it out in what we're calling a social clash. And then as a result of that social clash, institutions in the society are overturned and replaced with something entirely new. So you have a crisis. As a result of the crisis, people try to resolve the crisis with different ideas about how to do so. They fight it out in a social clash, and as a result of social clash, something's destroyed and something new is built. So for example, a society might find itself in a position where millions of people don't have access to health care, even though there's plenty of hospitals, plenty of doctors, etc. At some point, when it reaches a critical mass of people who don't have access to health care, it's considered a health care crisis. Different ideas then emerge about how to resolve the healthcare crisis. Some people say the way you resolve the healthcare crisis is to prevent patients from suing doctors. Others say it's by allowing patients to buy medicine in bulk. or the government to buy medicine in bulk. Other states for the government to come up with a competing healthcare insurance plan. Another state, the only way that you're actually going to resolve the healthcare crisis is by ensuring that every single human being, by virtue of the fact that a human being has full and total unfettered access to healthcare. These different ideas, or the forces behind the ideas, and fight it out in some kind of social clash. And as a result of that fighting out, the way in which the healthcare system works is overturned and something entirely new replaced. For good or for bad, some parts of it may be better, some parts of it may be worse, some parts of it may be functionally the same, but are entirely different. So the society then engages in this rigorous debate, and then as a result of this rigorous debate, we have an entirely new way, and a social clash that happens. We have an entirely way of doing things. So again, the process is crisis, social clash around the ideas of how to resolve the crisis, and then as a result of the social clash, an emergence of a new way in which society works, or at least a portion of the society, if not the whole society. To date, the U.S. has experienced 3 major social clashes. Of course, all kinds of social clashes, but the U.S. has experienced 3 major social clashes. The first social clash we commonly call the Civil War. The crisis was that, as a result of the developing industrial revolution, in a society where the existing economic system was slavery, there was a crisis in that there was an attempt in some way to have 2 economic systems exist in the same country. So the clash, of course, you can't have 2 economic systems exist in the same society simultaneously. So the clash, of course, was between which economic system would emerge. And this clash played itself out to the highest level, became a full-out civil war. And at the end, the entire society was changed. Slavery was abolished. The Industrial Revolution began and really took off here more than anywhere else. And the society was just fundamentally transformed forever. Again, for better or for worse, even some parts way better, some parts way worse, some parts exactly the same. But the society was entirely changed. The second major social clash was around what we commonly call the Great Depression. The crisis was a severe economic crisis, and as a direct result of the economic crisis, there was all kinds of ideas about how to resolve the crisis, let the markets take care of it. Others were saying that big business should do it, or government should have some level of interference in the markets. Others, however, argued that you have to not only address the core problems, or some of the core reasons why, some of the extreme reasons why the crisis happened in the first place, but there should be some impact on the extent to which people fell as a result of the crisis. So there was an argument that there should be a social safety net built. And as a result of an extremely well-organized and powerful labor movement, this society was transformed forever. A social safety net was built for the first time in this country. Child labor laws were put into effect. Labor rights were erected, and the society, again, for good or for bad or indifferent, or we would think it went too far, it didn't go far enough, there's no doubt that the society was changed forever. The third major social clash we commonly call the Civil Rights Movement. There was a lot going on there, not just the Civil Rights Movement, but just to focus on that one aspect, we had a crisis where we had an emerging black middle class who had economic means, but did not have any political rights, and were therefore no longer willing to tolerate the kind of political treatment they were receiving, which did not match the economic power that they had. There were, of course, a lot of other things going on, both in the civil rights movement narrowly, but also the anti-war movement, all kinds of other things. But the idea that the clash was what the legal system in this country is going to look like. Was it going to recognize racial differences and segregation, or was it not going to recognize those things? As a result of this clash, this society changed forever. Many people don't think it went far enough. I certainly don't think it went far enough. Some people think that it emphasized the wrong thing. But whatever the case, there's no question that it fundamentally transformed this society. As a direct result of the current ongoing economic crisis, we contend that the U.S. is on the cusp of entering its 4th major social clash. This crisis is deeply rooted in the current economic crisis, particularly in the housing sector of the economy. And therefore, because the crisis is rooted in the housing sector of the economy, people are the area in their lives that people are rethinking have to do with the housing sector. So millions of people are losing their homes, including large numbers, again, for the first time, of middle-class people and white middle-class people. Precisely the general population who is largely protected from the worst of these kind of economic hardships. And at the exact same time, these banks are reporting record profits, they're giving out these record bonuses, and they're having all kinds of wild and outlandish parties that people are finding out. And so people are really rethinking what some of this means. So more specifically, though, people are wondering aloud, should people be kicked out of their homes, even when the bank that is kicking them out is only able to be kicked out because it's only able to do the kicking out because they receive the money to kick them out from the taxpayers who they are actually kicking out. At what point does this become absurd? What is our responsibility to the banks? What is our responsibility to other human beings? So people now are beginning to question this and think about this for the first time. And these could go really to deep questioning about what the way the society is set up. So these questions that are raised by people who are suffering from the impact of the economic crisis form the cornerstone of the ideas about what caused the crisis in the first place, and therefore this kind of human suffering, and what can be done to correct the economic crisis. So from these questions are going to emerge a significant, if not dominant, poll about where we could potentially go after this crisis is over. One significant poll of what would become the social clash. So these questions represent, again, an opportunity for the social justice movement to develop, articulate, and meaningfully struggle for transformation in the way that society deals with housing and a whole series of other related issues. So I think as a result, we have now an opportunity which we have not had, at least since the 60s, I think probably further back since the 1930s, and possibly even if this is that time, possibly even further than that, to the kind of change that we had during the Civil War in this society. In his great, incredible book, Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon, who's a great African philosopher and thinker, said, every generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission and then either fulfill that mission or betray it. As a direct result of this economic crisis, this generation, this social justice movement, has the opportunity and therefore the mission to fundamentally change the way land relationships work in this country and elevate housing to the level of human right. We have the opportunity, the possibility, and the mission to, in our lifetime, elevate housing to the level of a human right. That is our mission. That's what we have to step forward and lead. In order to do that, though, we have to build a movement which is going to be capable of envisioning that and carrying us towards that. Part of carrying us towards that, of course, is understanding exactly the nature of what we are dealing with this time and precisely where it is we're going in the future. So while the economic crisis and the social class does mean that we have this opportunity to transform this society, it doesn't by any stretch of the imagination mean that we're actually going to transform this society. So in the same way that we have people who are rethinking things and some of them become more sympathetic to their neighbors who are suffering and some of them become less sympathetic to their neighbors who are suffering, we have a potential here. I think we're hitting the end of a road and we're going to make a hard turn in one direction or a hard turn in the exact opposite direction. So at the end of this social clash, I think we're going to see land relationships go in one direction entirely or an entirely different direction. We could potentially see housing become a human right, where every human being has access to good and decent housing. Or I can certainly imagine a situation where in 20 years, the United States consists of 5 landlords. As a result of massive foreclosures that are never to be sold. You have Bank of America as a landlord, Citibank as a landlord, Chase as a landlord, whoever else as a landlord. And basically the entire country is renting from one of 5 landlords and we'll go back to some level of high technology feudalism. I think that is an entirely possible direction. If instead of housing becoming a human right, we have greater and deepening corporate rights and corporate power. The difference between getting to one place and another, succeeding at our objective, or even falling somewhere woefully inadequate in the middle, I think is going to be clarity about where we ultimately want to end up. And part of that clarity for us, we think confusion here is the enemy of progress, so we want to smash the confusion by being extremely clear about what it is we're fighting about and what it is we're not fighting about. So an important part of clarity for us is distinguishing properly between what we call a core issue or a root issue and a surface issue. So a root issue and a surface issue. Root issue is the cause of a problem, and the surface issue is the manifestation of that problem, part of the problem that we have to deal with every day we can see and we can touch. And it's important not to confuse the two, because if you confuse the two, you can spend all your life dealing with surface issues and never getting to the root cause or the core issues. So, so we have again, the surface issues are those issues that we're forced to deal with, like foreclosures, people get kicked out of those things we have to deal with, but those are, we have to make sure that we don't think that that is the thing that we have to solve, that there's something actually deeper than that. So, for example, if you are going to a fancy dinner party, and you're all dressed up, you and your friends are dressed up, and you arrive at the fancy dinner party, and right before you start getting the food, your nose starts to run and drip all over your outfit. You are going to have to in some way deal with the fact that your nose is running and dripping. So you have to get a napkin and start dabbing at your nose all night. But while you're dealing with your nose dripping, you have to know that even though your nose dripping is problematic, that is not actually the problem. And if you don't understand that's not actually the problem, you could, in theory anyhow, spend the rest of your life dabbing at your nose because you don't know the problem. Because the real problem is not that your nose is running, the real problem is that you're sick, and your being sick is causing your nose to run. And not properly distinguishing between those two could cause you a whole lot of problems. That's not saying that you don't deal with your nose running, but it means that you have to know the difference between your nose running being the problem and your being sick being the problem. In the same way, in the 1950s and 60s, we had a serious problem of segregation, where you had the larger white community was able to say to the black community, you have to live in this area, you can only live in this area, this is the only place you're confined to these quarters, and you can't move anywhere else. These were the Jim Crow laws of segregation. The entire movement was built to dismantle the Jim Crow laws and end them, and ultimately they were ended, and segregation was over. More recently, in the 2000s, early 2000s, we had a similar situation in some ways, where the larger white community was able to go to black communities and say, the land that you're now sitting on, that we forced you onto, and we told you you couldn't leave from, this land is now valuable, so you have to leave there, and so that we can destroy your home and build condos up in those places. Objectively, there's no difference between someone saying to you, you have to live over there, and someone saying you can't live there, you have to move. In both instances, someone else is controlling where you live, work, sleep, worship, or whatever it is that you're doing. Now, some people actually believe that if they were to change a set of laws, the Jim Crow laws, the segregation laws, that the air would be cleaner, the water would be fresher, and their entire lives would be changed, and everything would be solved. And some people, that's actually all they wanted. They wanted to change those segregation laws so that they could do one thing in particular, whether it was shop somewhere or marry someone or whatever it was. Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State, talks about in her book how her family used to be able to go to this expensive boutique shop in Birmingham, Alabama, given segregation. They would have to wait till after hours. It was only black families that could go there. But as soon as the store was closed, they were allowed to go in and shop. So they didn't have a huge problem with segregation because they could just go to any place they wanted after. So for them, they literally, that's all they wanted was the laws to change, so they could shop at their expensive boutiques in the daytime rather than having to shop there at night. Of course, the idea that just ending those Jim Crow laws would solve would change people's lives, at least fundamentally, was of course absurd and absolutely wrong. Because the real issue in the 1950s and 60s was not segregation. And the real issue in the 2000s is not gentrification. The real issue in both instances was land and the lack of control over land. And until we fundamentally address the issue of land and land relationships and who controls land, then we're going to be forcing ourselves and those who come after us to refight those exact same battles over and over again. So failing to distinguish properly between the root issue of land and the surface issue that we have to deal with every day of segregation and of Jim Crow laws had dire consequences on the black community. And it also significantly informed many of the decisions that were made during the Civil Rights Movement, some of the poor decisions I think that were made during the Civil Rights Movement here. So just to be perfectly clear about what we're facing right now today, the root issue, the core issue that we're dealing with today is not foreclosures. The root issue is not what the principal reductions. The root issue is not what the interest rate is, or whether they're APRs, or whether they're fixed rates, or anything like that. Those are just manifestations of what the real problem ultimately is. In addition, the real issue is not the extent to which exotic derivatives are controlled or are regulated by Congress or by any other regulatory body. Those are just manifestations of what the real problem is. In addition, I think it should also be perfectly clear that we cannot build large-scale social movements based on derivative issues. We can only build them based on core issues. So people are not going to join a large social movement if they think the only objective of the social movement is to further regulate exotic financial instruments. They're going to join social movements if they believe at the end of that social movement, they're going to have control over land, over their communities, over their own individual homes, and really ultimately over their society. So failure, again, to properly understand the distinction between a root issue and a surface issue is going to cause all kinds of tactical errors, particularly, and we're going to start seeing that very soon, I suspect, with Occupy, as the powers that be start saying, here is a proposal, here is a compromise that we're willing to make. Our inability to clearly distinguish between what is a root issue and a surface issue is good. Those who are not able to clearly distinguish between the two are going to go for those compromises, and those who are not going to go for them. And I've been saying this for some time. It's been very difficult for us in many communities of color to get more public housing, for example, built. And I think a few years ago, 10 years ago, if some community were able to get 100, 500 extra public housing units built, I think that would have been a huge victory, and we would have been compelled to accept that victory, and it would have made national news in the context of what was going on 10 years ago. Today, however, if we're somehow able to take over large amounts of land and we're able to force a government to come in and say, okay, we're going to do one-to-one replacement, but we're going to build 1,000 extra public housing units, the social justice movement should reject that as a offer, because that would not be a big enough victory. We could, instead of maintaining land relationships, just increasing the number of public housing units that are held by the government, we could actually change land relationships themselves and ultimately create the housing that we need to create ourselves without having to forcing groups to fight over a small amount of housing. So the kind of change that we want to see here, the kind of transformation that we want to see here is not just in numbers or tinkering around the edges, it's fundamentally changing land relationships, and that's what's going to allow us to solve once and for all this housing crisis as it were. So we're trying to build then, so ultimately our core issue is land, at least as far as take back land is concerned, and that is what we need to be moving towards, changing land relationships as a big vision for where we're going and how we're solving this problem. And if we build a movement that is just shooting to low principal on people who have mortgages, I think we're headed entirely in the wrong direction, although that might be one component of a larger land reform movement. And there's some discussion and debate about that. Maybe we can have that. So ultimately, in terms of the social clash, we are building a movement for community control over land and to elevate housing to the level of a human right. So those are two things that we'd like to see come at the end of it. That we have community control over land, whatever that means, however that ends up happening, and that we elevate housing to the level of a human right. Those are two core political objectives, not demands, of political objectives. In order to achieve those political objectives, we're going to have fundamental shifts in how we view certain phenomena in this society. For example, how we view development is going to have to radically shift. Right now, I think most people think of, when they think of the word development, they imagine buildings being built and think of development as new tall buildings, particularly in New York, internet access, central air conditioning, and all these other fancy things. But we contend that development is not fundamentally about buildings and not fundamentally about things or high-speed internet or even technology, but that development has to fundamentally be about human beings. If development is about things, then this society will go down as the greatest society in the history of humankind. It's developed more things, built more things, more rapidly than any other society in the history of the world. It has. There's no, this is not debatable. However, the same society that has built incredible buildings, invented the internet, and did all this other thing, has more people in prison today than China, with 10 times its population. The United States excels at developing things and fails miserably at developing human beings. And ultimately, if all you're developing things is for the sake of things, then you are failing as a society. That cannot possibly last. That is not sustainable. So development ultimately has to be about human beings, and we have to shift that. In the same way, we have to shift what the fundamental concept is of housing. So what is the fundamental purpose of housing in society? Most people believe that the fundamental purpose of a house is to serve as a home for a family. But in this society, that's not the fundamental purpose of a house. The fundamental purpose of a house is to serve as an investment vehicle or a profit center for a bank or a speculator or even an individual homeowner who's going to buy it for a certain amount today and resell it for twice as much in 5 years or in 10 years. So we have to fight to make housing serve people, not just to be seen as a place to park your money to grow personal or corporate wealth. So the fundamental purpose of housing, we think, is going to be at the core, one of the cores of this coming social clash. And the way that we think that housing will come at the core of the social clash is that people are going to see it as a fight or a clash between two rights, or at least perceived rights. On the one side, you have the right of human beings to housing, and on the other side, you have the right of corporations to make a profit. The two rights are increasingly mutually exclusive. Everyone gets the right to housing, corporations don't make the profit they want. If corporation makes the profit they want, then people don't get the housing that they need. And this society is going to be judged, among other things, on how it resolves this clash. There are clashes of rights happening all the time. One person has the right to peace and quiet, another person has the right to free speech. How does society resolve those two conflicting rights? We assert that the right of human beings to housing supersedes the right of corporations to make a profit. And so if we have to choose between one right and the other, we have to, in each instance, fall on the side of the right of human beings to make a profit over and above, even at the expense of the right of corporations to make a profit. Take Back the Land was formed really in a real way on this point. We want not just to have this point exist in some theoretical sense, we need to have this point exist in a real, tangible sense. We wanted to, on our own, enforce the human right to housing ourselves. And one of the ideas that we had in a general sense and continue to have today, we try to make it as specific as possible, is that we have an obligation towards other human beings. And when the government, which is seen in terms of the concept of the social contract, is either unable or unwilling to continue to facilitate us meeting those obligations, then we still have that obligation to other human beings, and we have to fulfill that obligation nonetheless. So if the government is unable or unwilling to do it for whatever reason, then we have to implement our own public policy. There's an empty house over here, there's a family that doesn't have to live anywhere to live over there. We have an obligation then to move that family into this house. So beginning in 2006 with the Emotion Village Shantytown, but then in 2007, in a real way, Take Back the Land began the process of identifying vacant government-owned and foreclosed homes. We break into them and we move homeless people into the homes. And then when they're found, we physically defend them and prevent them from getting evicted by the police. Take Back the Land is formed, and we've been doing this again in one shape or form since 2006 in Miami, and then we've been doing it in several other cities actually since about 2009. We're organized around 4 core principles: housing is a human right, local securing community control over land, that the leadership of any movement like the one that we're trying to build must be led by impacted communities. For us, this means low-income Black women, and that we are focused on what we call positive action campaign. Most people call it direct action or civil disobedience. We have an additional distinction. So if civil disobedience is, so in terms of the way the scale goes, so free speech or free speech, I guess, would be people talking about how they feel, openly being able to say, I feel this way about this government policy or that way. And then if you escalate that to the next step, you're protesting, you're outside, standing on the sidewalk, holding a sign, saying, I feel this way. You escalate that to the next level, and it would be direct action. That could be breaking the laws. You take your sign from the sidewalk, and you go and you're blocking the streets, and you're preventing traffic, and you are breaking the law as a way of making your political point, more so than just talking, more so than just protesting. And then the next level after direct action is then civil disobedience. And civil disobedience, you are breaking the specific law with which you have moral objection. So when you are out protesting and you have a sign and you're blocking traffic, you're breaking a law, but most people don't have a moral objection to traffic laws. I think cars should, drive on the side of the street they're driving on. I don't think people in normal circumstances should be able to walk in the street at any given time, except in New York, of course. Should be at any given time when there's cars going. There are traffic laws, and traffic laws are good. I fully support normalized traffic law. But if, for example, there's a law that says Black people can't sit in some particular place that white people can go, that those are laws we should be intentionally breaking because we have moral objection. With positive action campaign, we're not just breaking laws that we find morally objectionable, we are implementing laws that we find morally good, or that for which we have a moral obligation. So civil disobedience would be doing an eviction defense. That would be where we're breaking a law and saying the family should be moved out of there. Moving a family into a home is what we call positive action. We're actually implementing the laws that we think should be implemented. So Take Back the Land is engaged in positive action. We call these positive action campaigns both the positive action component and the civil disobedience component. In 1960, you had 4 young men who were students at North Carolina A&T who went to the Woolworths in Greensboro, and they sat in and they began the saddle movement. They wouldn't move until they were served food, and then they were arrested, and then the next wave came and they were arrested. And that began what was called the sit-in movement. And people there were sitting in for the right to eat where they wanted to eat, and ultimately to sit on the bus where they wanted to sit on the bus, etc. When we engage in the actions of moving people into homes and defending them from eviction, we call these live-ins. So we're engaged in live-in campaigns. And we want to enhance the live-in campaigns and step them up to the next level. So again, in a general sense, we call them positive action campaigns. We're building we're calling a trans-local network, not a national organization. We're very loose on the top. We only have, Take Back the Land has 15 affiliated organizations throughout the United States. And we have several more who we're working with. We're not officially affiliated, but we only have 3 people on the Take Back the Land national leadership team. We really don't need more than that. We're very light on the top. We mainly do coordination and talking. We're not building a national organization where we have top-down. We're building what we call a trans-local network. And all we do is we go to the local groups and say, what can we do to help make your campaign successful and help make your campaigns work? So again, we engage in these positive action campaigns. We've been doing this since 2009 as a way of putting these actions into, putting these ideas into, these ideas of housing as a human right and community control over land into action. Ultimately, what we want to, let me say one more thing about land, however, as a core issue. So we obviously have a lot of people who are engaged in Take Back the Land with a wide variety of political orientations and backgrounds. The core groups who started have a combination of Marxists and Pan-African or Black nationalist backgrounds. In fact, there's a big distinction between Pan-African and Black nationalists. But one of the things that we thought was extremely important to talk about that is not talked about in narrow Marxist circles is land as a core issue. We talk about labor, we talk about capital in relation between the two, and all kinds of other issues, but land is really brought up an issue. And yet, if you look at all the third world socialist movements, decolonization movement in Africa, in Asia, the land is a core important issue. And people talk about land in a way that they just don't talk about in the narrow Marxist organization. So we thought it was extremely important to talk about and think about land as a core issue. That's why we identified it as a core issue. We also thought it was very interesting that we think about land as a core issue, and those who are doing a lot of the Occupy work think of the economic system as the core issue, and then land almost as a derivative of that. And we think of land relations as core issues, and the economic system almost as a derivative of the land issue. So we just thought that was very interesting the way that it's working out in that sense. In terms of where we're ultimately trying to go with this is things that we've talked about internally, and a little bit publicly, but not much. We are trying to reach critical mass with this kind of work as a way of forcing the powers that were benefiting now from the kind of economic exploitation that's going on to see the financial benefit in allowing housing as a human right and even community control over land. So we think that can happen in a couple of ways. First of all, the civil rights movement, particularly the Montgomery bus boycott, was really one based on narrow economic self-interest. So when the Montgomery bus boycott was happening, it was almost a year where there was virtually no one riding on the bus system. And the Birmingham City Council was on the verge of having to decide whether they were going to allow Black people to sit wherever they wanted on the bus or declare bankruptcy as a city, because they were paying for these buses to drive around empty all day long all throughout the city, and no one was riding on it to subsidize it, to pick up the cost. They were literally taking money out of picking up trash and moving things in the city just so they could run empty buses around them. So they had to literally make a financial decision as to whether or not that made sense for them to continue to do, or if they were going to end segregation on the buses in order to avoid bankruptcy ultimately. In the same way, when the sit-ins happened, businesses were shut down for days and days on end, and because they couldn't serve any food, because all the people who were sitting on their seats were black, and not only did they not want to serve them, but it was against the law for them to serve them. They would have served them, they would have been arrested themselves. So when it finally came up before the local city commissions, some of the people who were really pushing to end segregation laws were the small business owners, who were saying that if you don't end this law, we're going to go out of business. Not because we want to serve them, but because we have an economic self-interest in ending these laws so that we don't go out of business and our families don't economically suffer. So in the same way, we think we have two tracks that we need to go down in order to make it in the economic self-interest of this system to recognize move towards the political objectives that we have. On the banking side, we need to take over a critical mass, a critical number of foreclosed homes, either take them over new or prevent the evictions from happening in the first place. We don't know what the number is, but we think there's a number out there that we can mathematically come on, and of course there is also a political number. But if, for example, a bank owns 50,000 vacant homes, they're worth whatever billions of dollars, and we take over 20,000 of them, and they're valued at whatever they're valued at $1 billion. And the banks have lost a mortgage on it, supposedly, because they were foreclosed on. And they had to spend money to do a foreclosure, and spend money to do an eviction, and then board the place up, and then we move into them. Then they have to spend money again to evict a second family. And then they potentially get the money for it. So the banks say, okay, look, these homes are worth $10 million. It's their value of them. We've already spent $5 million, $10 billion. We've already spent $5 billion on lost mortgage amounts and foreclosure fees and eviction fees. And then now we have to do a second round of eviction fees. And in 6 months, we have to do another round of eviction fees because they just keep moving back to the same place. At some point, the shareholders of the bank have to say, it would actually cost us less over the course of 2 or 3 years, whatever the amount of time is. It'll cost us less to give these houses to a nonprofit and take the full tax write-down than it would be for us to continue to evict these people and have the value go down. It has to be in the economic self-interest of the bank to say we'd rather give away 50,000 homes and continue to go through this process. So that's on the bank side. On the municipal side, in Miami-Dade County, where the city of Miami is located, which of course is one of the extreme cases that has one of the worst foreclosure crises in the United States. In Miami-Dade County, it used to be when people got a 24-hour eviction notice, the police literally came 24 hours, it literally meant 24-hour eviction notice. Sometimes they would come 2 days later. Today, in Miami, when you get a 24-hour eviction notice, the police don't come for 7 to 14 business days. I mean, it's really, really can be a long stretch between the time you get the 24-hour eviction. And when they come, the cop comes, one cop car comes, they open the door, let them, the move out, trash out company come in, and then they sit there, fill out their paperwork, and they're gone in 20 minutes. So the whole thing for them is 20, and then they go to the next house, and they're still several weeks behind schedule. When we did an eviction defense for the Trody family, which is a family that was featured in the Michael Moore movie, Capitalism Love Story, they were evicted from their home on a Friday. They spent the weekend living in a bread truck, and the following Monday we moved them right back into the same home from which they were evicted. And then of course we called the police and we asked them to come so we could have it out with them. We were ready with 50 people there, we had people ready to take arrests, etc. The police came with 8 police cars and 9 police altogether. They were there about 2 hours. And then afterwards, they didn't arrest anyone. They got in the car and they left. And they came back twice more. They spent a lot. So if we can get them 15, 20% of the time to, instead of having 1 police car come, they have 5, 10, 15 police cars come, we could force the mayor to hold a press conference and then say, because of all these foreclosure defenses, we have to stop. And then his next words are either going to be doing evictions or picking up trash or investigating murders. He's got to choose between doing evictions or investigating murders and picking up trash. And because he won't be able to do both, it'll drain the budget for them to continue to do these type of evictions. So it'll be in the economic self-interest of the cities, of the municipalities, the counties, to stop doing it. This is the critical mass that we think we need to reach in order to have the proper amount of leverage. And because we haven't reached this critical mass, we have not been interested, frankly, in engaging in county negotiations or developing demands, because we don't want to do that until we're in a position to really achieve some of the demands. The kind of demands that we could get reached now are not the kind of demands that we actually even want. Organizations. With that said, there's several local groups that are working towards getting individual families in their home. But even when we're doing that, we're openly saying, we're winning this is what we're doing now, but we don't think this is a victory. We're doing this now to build power, but we really want to see something happen later on in the future. So real quick on Occupy Wall Street. So this is the Occupy work that's happening now is incredibly inspiring, and we're thrilled with it. I've been down to Occupy Wall Street several times, and I've been to helping out with Miami. I've been to 2 in DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia. I've been in contact with some of the people in a couple of other places. Chicago, I've been there. So we are thrilled with the Occupy movement. We think it's incredible and great, and we're huge supporters of it. What we do when we open up homes is we've been calling that since we did the first action in 2006, liberating land. Not occupying land, but liberating land. So we think that the banks now are occupying homes, and we want them out of the occupation, and we want to liberate them for the people. And we want to liberate them for human use, and that's what we're calling it. We think the liberating land has a few characteristics, and we're trying to flesh out the characteristics, but some of the characteristics are that it would actually be used for specific types of human use, but particularly habitation, but also can be used for growing food. We can liberate land and farm there, which is some of the things we want to do, and do all kinds of other stuff as well. There's a big political difference between occupy and liberate. And political forces from time to time may have to do both. And that's great, and different portions of the movement could be responsible for occupation, and others could be responsible for liberation. A goal of a movement, a goal of those in power should not be to occupy. Even if you have to occupy, ultimately the goal of the occupation, if you have to do that, would ultimately be to liberate, not to occupy. So we think now, and in addition, we think it's also extremely interesting that the liberation work has been almost entirely low-income people of color. And the Occupy work has been almost entirely young white kids and former middle class, either middle class or lower middle class. And we think that's good, by the way. There's a lot of organizations of color who have been saying that there should be political leadership from black organizations and organizations of color. We think that it's good that we have large numbers of whites who are becoming politically active on a progressive side, at least, if not further down the radical side. And we think that those are good, legitimate political moves of political organization. What we think is happening now is that we're seeing the development of a big social justice movement that could be moving towards a common political objective or common direction at the end of the social clash. But we see it evolving in 2 tracks, the Occupy track and the Liberate track. We think the 2 tracks are there. We think they're emerging, and they're going to continue to emerge clearly separately. We think it's good that they emerge in these separate ways. We think there's a tendency now to think about the 2 tracks emerging in two different ways. The tendency to think about them in 2 ways. One is to think about the 2 tracks as 2 movements that are separate movements and should be separate movements. We think that is incorrect and wrong. They are one movement, although the 2 tracks are in the same movement. They should be communicating. We think the other tendency is to think of the 2 tracks as needing to merge and turn into one track. I think there'll be a huge tactical error. If we have 2,000 white kids walk to Harlem and occupy Harlem, this would not be a good advancement of social justice. So we think that the fact that there's 2 tracks, in addition, one of the tracks, the Liberate tracks, deals with people on our turf, in our land, in our communities, and liberating those lands. The other takes the fight to those who would be, who are responsible for the exploitation. We can't just defend our turf all the time. Sometimes we have to take the fight to them. So we think this is incredible work that's happening, that's being done. We are, I spent a good chunk of September working on a proposal that we call the 2012 Spring Offensive. We said we need to do through the spring of 2012, we need to have massive land liberations, eviction defenses, and shutting down of bank branches tied to the eviction defenses. And so we could, for example, conceivably on Monday liberate a home, on Tuesday do an eviction defense of that home, on Wednesday go and shut down the bank branch, demanding the bank give that home over to the community. On Thursday, go to the bank manager's house, his own personal house, and protest there and give out flyers so that his neighbors know what he's doing. And then on Friday, have people in that community withdraw their money from the bank. There's going to be a whole range of activity that can happen around 1 or 2 particular actions, and have multiple actions. But when we're planning on making the announcement the first week of October. Of course, when some of the Occupy stuff started happening, we took a step back and we wanted to really understand and recognize that we didn't want to compete with that for attention. And we've since then talked to Occupy Wall Street. So we're going to make a call for the 2012 Spring Offensive. This is the first time we're really talking about it in a real public way. Call for a 2012 Spring Offensive, which would include liberations, eviction defenses, occupations, and shutting down bank branches and other institutions, which are directly responsible for the economic crisis. We think that this way this movement can go ultimately together. The way that this movement could move forward together with these two tracks, working in conjunction with each other in order to maximize their impact. I don't have time to go into this, we're going to get to the discussion part. I do want to say, I think that we are now heading into an extremely unique historical moment. We're heading into a historical moment where we have a crisis that's opening up opportunities for social justice forces, radical forces to do work that we just simply have not been able to do before. And we all have an obligation then to step up and participate in that work. That doesn't mean everyone's obligation is exactly the same. Some people's obligation include them getting arrested. Some people's obligation include them facing down the police. Other people's obligation include not getting arrested so that they can get the people who got arrested out of jail. Other people's obligations can be filled by doing research. Other people's obligation can be, there's a whole broad range, it's a broad movement. And the broad movement needs to have lots of places where people, individuals, can contribute to the overall advancement of life, to the overall advancement of this society. Whichever way that someone decides to participate in this movement, they still have to participate in the movement. So if you decide that you are not someone who gets arrested, there's nothing wrong with that, but you can't say I'm not getting arrested and then not do anything in the alternative. Everyone has an obligation to participate in the movement and participate in the march of history, to the march toward history. And where other people were waiting for the time where I would have been very active in 60s or active, that time is ending. Right now is the time that something is happening. It's also important to note, however, that as people want to participate and should want to participate in the march of history, no one can participate in the march of history alone. Stokely Carmichael used to say, later became known as Kwame Ture, used to say, if Martin Luther King would have went by himself to Birmingham, Alabama to denounce racism, he would have been lynched in 5 minutes. But that's not what he did. He surrounded himself with tens of thousands of people who believe in the same ideas, the same objectives, and they together marched to Birmingham to denounce racism. Individuals can't win social justice cause. No one has ever, no people have ever tripped and fell into freedom. No oppressor has ever accidentally liberated the people that they were oppressing. Liberation and end of oppression only happen through people joining organizations and those organizations working tirelessly and struggling towards liberation. We have an obligation to participate in this particular moment in history, and you have an obligation to participate in an organization that is active in this moment in history. Whatever specific way that plays out, you have an obligation to join an organization and have an organization that is actively moving towards the liberation of people, the liberation of land. Thank you.
Max, thank you very much. I've known you for about 4 years, I think, and I have a host of questions, but I'm going to cease and desist from it in the name of the movement that you're exactly the name of which you're speaking, and try and get other people to come forward with questions, comments, disagreements, arguments. Jessica.
I was just curious how you choose the neighborhoods that you work in.
How we choose?
How you choose the neighborhoods that you work in.
So in Miami, I've been doing political work in Liberty City almost since I got there. So I got there 20 years ago. I lived in the southern part of Miami-Dade County, and then 5 years later, started to live in the northern part. And we do political work in Liberty City, Little Haiti, and several black communities. So I do my political work in black communities. That's where I want to do political work. That's where I think the problems are the worst. I think we should put the greatest effort in the places where the problems are the worst, so that when that comes up, that's where you make the greatest level of improvement. That's where I do my political work. In terms of where we choose to take back the land nationally, organizations contact us, and then we work with them. So we don't have, the big requirements we have is that they have to agree that housing is a human right. They have to agree that there should be community control over land, and to agree to either do eviction defenses or land liberation as part of their work there. And we try to help them whatever way we can. So we don't have we don't go and say, okay, this is strategically where we want to do work. where there are people who are developed enough to do some of the work, and we go there. Most of the organizations, so one of the problems, of course, that raises is that it tends to favor those who are better organized or, in many instances, better resourced. Certainly that is looking the case now. However, when we started in 2009, very, very few organizations were doing this. And a lot of the organizations who are considering doing it, or you're going to see doing it over the next few months, land liberation, would not touch us with a 10-foot pole in 2009. And we had a very, very strange, I was just talking to Professor Smith about this before, we had a very, very strange turn of events. When we first started doing this work, we were trying to figure out what are the criteria that we're going to use to determine which organizations join Take Back the Land, which don't. And our bar ultimately was that it would only be organizations who believe that housing is a human right and community control of land as objectives. But we thought there were several organizations which met that criteria, but then were also willing to break this law. So breaking the law is an integral part of what Take Back the Land does. So we say this all, Take Back the Land really only does two things. We break into houses and we block the police from doing evictions. That's really, and that's our role in the movement. So we've remained relatively small. We don't get funding. We're not a 501c3. We don't want to be a 501c3. We're very, very small. We do a very, very specific thing. And we're even starting to talk about now when that specific thing has been accomplished, we're going to dissolve. So it's not going to be too terribly long before we Take Back as an organization evolve. So, but anyway, saying that, so we had a very unusual situation where we were saying that in order to join, you'd have to have these objectives, which seem like there's several organizations who agreed with that, but then you'd have to be willing to break the laws and do eviction offenses, and we were not, we had trouble getting it. We had a lot of very small organizations, non-501c3s, who were willing to cross that bar, and that's how we ultimately got this group. And we had several organizations who agreed with those objectives, but we're not willing yet to do that. Now, because the situation has changed so drastically, and it was already starting to happen through the summer, but now after this Occupy stuff's going on, that number has just completely exploded. We have an exact opposite problem. We have a plethora of organizations willing to break into housing and do eviction defense. We have a lot of occupiers who are trying to figure out what they're going to do over the winter, so they're trying to break into housing and defense. But we have very few of them who think housing should be a human right, or think that there should be community control of the land. So a lot of them right now, several of the former ACORN groups and others, were providing some technical support for, in terms of how to do some of this land liberation and eviction defense. But what they're moving towards is principal reduction, or things that help the individual families, but don't move towards some of the bigger policy. Even that, we're looking to do something a little bigger than policy, but not even matching with the policy. So this is a significant problem for us figuring out how to relate to that. We don't go and say we should have one here, one there. It's when they contact us, we work with them.
So what happens after you liberate the land? I know that in the past few years, a lot of people have started talking again and renewing arguments about community land trusts and different models of ownership, mutual housing associations. And so do you see that as part of one of the goals of this movement, or do you see that as something for another set of people to take up? Or?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to blaze through this really quickly. That actually has a lot to do with this thing that I want to do. I'm going to do this a lot quicker than I want to. Sorry. All right, so we developed a metaphor. So we start talking at some point, well, what are we doing actually? We try to build an organization, or particularly because we knew that at some point Take Back the Land could sunset. And we're really building, we weren't really institution building in a real sense, because we weren't getting any money and things like that. So we developed a metaphor for what the movement ultimately, what we're trying to do. And it was we're not just trying to build an organization, we're trying to build a movement. And we developed a metaphor for what the movement is, which is a spear. And of course, we couldn't afford to get, we didn't have budgets, we couldn't afford to get a graphic artist to draw a spear, so we had to get whatever arrow came with things. So this is supposed to be a spear. So the work that we do at Take Back the Land, we see as the tip of the spear. We call that, and that's what we have been calling positive action. And that is two things: breaking into houses, doing eviction defense. That's it. Now, the tip of the spear, the job of the tip of the spear is to penetrate an opening. The actual thing that kills the animals are really the two ends, not the spear. It kills them more when the spear is coming out or when you turn it, something like that. But the tip has to be very sharp and serves a very, very particular function. But the other parts don't really, don't come into play. And it was also very interesting because we have a lot of policy organizations that have really, really good ideas. Some of them we agree with, some of them we don't, about how to address the housing crisis and the economic crisis. but can't get up to bat. They just, in this political economy, they don't have, I mean, we can't pass weak jobs bills right now. There's nothing that can go through. So we felt like this positive action would put pressure on, would create these political openings and allow this other space to happen. So we had two incidents that helped flesh out this model, right? So the one, not in chronological order, one that happened in Madison, Wisconsin. Madison, we had this incredible 2 weeks in a row, we had actions, one Monday, and it led the news every night, amazing action. And then I went to one of the actions. It was really, really impressive, and I saw it on the news and just the buzz that they got. Went back home, several weeks later, I get a call from Madison. They're like, you're not gonna believe this. We just got a call from the mayor of Madison. This was in May 2010, so this was, I must have got the call in June or July. We just got a call from the mayor of Madison. He wants to meet with us. He said, look, I don't agree with everything you guys did, or they said, but you made some really good points, and you said that the laws now are built to protect the banks rather than the people of Madison. Come in, tell us what laws you think should be changed, and we'll take a look at it, maybe we'll change them. And we were like, what? And we had, they were like, so what do we do? And I'm like, I don't know what we do. So we had no way of relating to the mayor outside of protesting and we're demanding they designate. So it was just a total shock. So the question in terms of the movement model was, what happens if you engage in positive action and you win? Then what do you do? So that created the second movement area, which is public policy. And I use policy here in a very broad sense. It could include bank things, it could be major shifts. So if we win, and then what are the laws we want to see change, what are the behaviors we want to see change, and how do we actually do that? And there's another point of that. The other incident we had happened in Miami with the St. Troy family, with the Michael Moore movie, moved them into a house. They were there 6 months after we moved them in. They're still there today, by the way. They've been there 3 years. 6 months after we moved them in, my cell phone rings. I don't recognize them, I pick it up. It's U.S. Bank. It's the bank that owns the house. They found my cell phone number. They called and said, we don't want to fight. Don't call the media. Don't protest. We want to give you the house for free. The only reason we've been calling you is we want to know who we should make the deed out to. Should we make it to the family, to you, to the organization? I was like, what? So we discussed it, but we had no idea what to do. And by the time we finally got our act together and had some idea, it was too late. They gave us like 60 days. We couldn't figure out what to do in 60 days. So the question then became, if we engage in positive action and we win, and the bank says, here, you can have the house, then what do you do? So that developed in the third movement area, which we're calling alternative structures. So here we think we do not have alternative structure is the least figured out. We're way behind on policy. We're way behind on alternative is the least developed part of our movement model. But with alternative structures, we think this has to be some kind of democratically controlled community land trust. But we don't know exactly what that means. And not only do we not know exactly what it means, one of our theories is that whatever this is doesn't exist yet. Or if it exists, it doesn't work. It's a total and complete failure right now because it cannot work in this economy. It would be like if you had an iPad 2 in 1960. There's no internet, there's no digital music, no one knows what an app is, much as all you have is a shiny box that can't do anything, right? So we think that this alternative structures could be, right now, if we knew what this was now, it would be a complete total. It doesn't work in this particular economy. It's only going to work in the next economy. So right now, I think this is some kind of, today we would say this is some kind of land trust co-op kind of thing. And that's because that's seen as the most progressive thing you can have right now. We think it's very possible, we don't know this for sure. In 20 years, people are like, co-ops, that's for suckers. That co-ops will be seen in 20 years as a regressive form of land control. And there's going to be something way more progressive. We don't know exactly what that is going to be right now. The other thing that is interesting that we started to realize as we did this work is that, again, there are some level of existence of these two areas, area number 2 and area number 3, policy and alternative structures. The problem is that they don't have any power. They can't get this. So it turns out there are people in Madison who have ideas about how to address the foreclosure problem. They can't get a meeting with the mayor. We get a meeting with the mayor, and we didn't know what to say about policy things. So in terms of a movement, we think this has to be a holistic movement. And for one reason. So we don't want to take back the land. We only want to do area number 1. We don't want to do area number 2. We don't want to do area number 3. For a number of reasons. One is we just think there are other things other people should you can do that and should do that. The other thing is that those who engage in area number 1 are a very self-selecting group and who actually want to break into houses and block in the police. And the people who want to break into houses and block in the police, if in all honesty, and some of them don't want to admit this, actually do not want to negotiate with the mayor. They want to sit with the mayor and say, fuck you, but they don't want to sit with the mayor and say, I will compromise on this. And when you have a chance to win something, that is the exact people you do not want in it. Right? So we would, if the mayor said, what are your demands? We would know what the demands were. And then if we said, we want 100, he said, here's 99, we would say, fuck you, and we would not take 99, and then we would get nothing, right? So we didn't have other people who can then do it. The other thing is that the people who break into homes and do eviction defenses do not want to be landowners. They do not want to be landlords. So we're woefully unqualified to do anything about area number 3. So we want to be realistic about that. And if we're going to build a movement, this is not organizations now, this is a movement. There's going to be separate organizations or clusters of organizations in each one of these 3 parts. We have several other parts to it as well.
Guy in the back, yeah. Yourself, yeah.
Okay, it sounds like you're talking about organizations, a little bit like the ones that I have in my community, that I'm trying to bring them on board to, occupy Wall Street. But they've been working in the community for 30, 40 years, and they've been able to create a niche for themselves in providing, services for the Asian community. Now, for them to take the step, because they've been able to do this, right, through the system, but maybe they were a long time ago, right, out there on the street. Now there's this opportunity for them to come back on the street and put the Asian community on the map in which it has never been before. They don't know how to do it. I can't get them to. So it sounds like, it's somewhat like what you're saying is that, you want to break in the house, but you want to become landlords. Now we have these people who are landlords, and they don't know how to break back into the house.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, how do you work with them? Is there a role for them in this? How do they take the step within this new period of vast social change?
Right.
Can I just piggyback on that? Just to ask you to address the other side of that. So in addition to how do we get these kinds of community organizations on board, how can academics also be involved in
Right.
the other side of the sphere?
So 2 things that are just 2 quick response. One, not direct response, indirect response. In terms of the organization and doing things for 30 years, one of the difficult things to kind of hold in your mind is that all of this is a moving target. So before I started doing work with Take Back Land, I was doing anti-police brutality work. And I stopped doing that because I think there's a group of us that recognize we're about to enter into some serious, into a time where this is serious land reform work time. But there are organizations that were breaking into houses doing eviction defense since like the 80s and 90s. They were doing the right action, but they were doing it at the wrong time. And the same action done today means something entirely different than someone occupying Zuccotti Park, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, would just look like a bunch of crazies, because it wouldn't have meant the same thing at the same time. So I think one of the things we keep in mind is people feel upset because they tried something and it didn't work, but they just tried it at the wrong time. You know what I'm saying? So just saying that it's one of the very difficult things to keep in mind, and people I think have trouble handling, is the fact that something that doesn't work today might very well work tomorrow, and vice versa. So that's just very difficult to keep in mind, I think, as people are doing work over long periods of time. In terms of how we get the organizations involved, to be honest with you, in terms of Take Back the Land, so I'm starting to shift and do some of the work with those organizations, so I'm trying to learn how to do that now. With Take Back the Land, that's not our job. Take Back the Land's job is to bring in the houses and do eviction defense, and that's it. And kind of set the model for that, and then share that model with others. So we can move that. It's been very difficult for us to work with community organizations, just because we have such a very narrow view of what's going on. So it's been very difficult for us to do that. Now, back on this thing for a second, we have a 4th area where we show, okay, so if these 3 areas exist, and these are the 3 different, movement areas, what holds them together? What keeps this from being just a bunch of elements floating around the room? to having chairs here, boards here, we're proposing together. So we think that's a fourth movement area, which is a facilitation and collaboration space. And that's what I'm moving towards that and trying to learn what it means to work with these different groups and get them to work together. So a couple things about that, just fleshing this out a little more, and also answering the question about academics. Under positive action, we think positive action is this thing, but underneath that needs to happen a certain number of things, like community organizing and other things. And we think in some cases, at least up until now, it's been better to keep the community organizing and the positive action separate for a number of reasons, not the least of which is legal reasons. So in several cities where we have local Take Back the Land groups, it's a local Take Back the Land group that's not incorporated and not affiliated anywhere. And it's mainly because the 501c3s have been afraid of losing their 501c3 status, but actually ended up helping out. In Rochester, New York, we took over 2 homes owned by Fannie Mae, and we were in control of them. Fannie Mae put an emergency injunction in court that we found out completely by accident against Take Back the Land Rochester. They had an emergency injunction to enjoin Take Back the Land for coming within 100 feet of any Fannie Mae home in Rochester, New York. Right? It would have been a total nightmare to figure out what that means. The courts rejected it. You know why? Take Back the Land, Rochester doesn't legally exist. So it would have been a 501c3, I think it would have been, they would have been able to have that happen. And probably the next step would have been to start suing the organization for money. But anyway, so a bunch of stuff needs to happen underneath that, like organizing, etc. And then there's all kinds of support needs to happen in policy. So when we successfully win one of these campaigns, we're only going to be able to win it with the help of somebody. So the other thing we learned with Take Back the Land is that we can't win campaigns. Like, we go and we do these takeovers, that's not enough. At some point, the family comes to us and they're like, this is great and everything that you're coming here every time the police come here, but we don't want the police to come here anymore. We want to own the house. And this is where we need to help with some of these community organizations. So this has to be a holistic movement. To be completely honest with you, we're just learning what that means now. We haven't been very successful with it now. As I'm shifting from area number 1 to area number 4, I'm just trying to grapple with what that means now. It's very, very complex and very hard to shift to that.
Let me know in Chinatown when you figure it out.
Yes.
There's 3 hands up. I saw the first 2 in the back first. So, Carl, yeah, why don't we take 3 questions at once here? Let's do that. And then, cool. Carl, you want to start?
I feel like there's a model of organizing that's like local, you build a community organization and then you set things up and you set a model like that. And there's a model of just replication and duplication, or of having an idea set out and then having people basically still creating the same model. And then there's people who are essentially doing the same thing but quietly, recognizing themselves as part of the movement. And it seems like there's a lot of people staying in their homes, not paying their bank, and not putting any flag down on it, but who are sort of a virtual part of this movement. What is it that you see your relationship to them as, and how do you see ways of defending them in those moments when either the banks or the police become involved in their situation?
Let me get the next couple as well.
My dissertation is on limited equity co-ops.
Speak up a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. My dissertation is on limited equity co-ops, which may or may not be a good model, but there's lots of problems with them, but I think they do offer a locally controlled group model of home ownership, and starting to collaborate with, there's a task force, HDFC task force, that meeting with politicians to discuss how to enforce things better. I'm just curious, and community land trust, why you see these as not possibly alternative structures, and how to help figure out what would be.
Can we take a third? Max?
Take those 2.
Well, would you rather?
I got it.
Okay.
Okay, so I wanted to hear more from you why you think the land is the core issue and not the economic system. What is this distinction about? Because it made me think a little bit about the landless movement in Brazil, for example, that does land occupations, rural land occupations, big rural land occupations, but for them the goal is to change the economic structure. So like land occupation is actually an instrument or a mechanism to achieve something that is, for them, is broader. So why for you the land is the core issue? And then my other question would be related to this, like to what extent the movement collaborates with other movements in other parts of the world? How are you connected or not? And if I can make a third one, I wanted to understand a little bit more what is the role of legal mobilization in your...
What is the
role of legal mobilization? How do you deal with the legal issues? If you have like lawyers collaborating in this eviction defense, how does it work?
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Let me just say, in terms of the different types of organizational structures or way of relating to the movement, I do want to say, in terms of people doing things individually, that does have some impact. But I do not think you can be part of a movement if you're not doing things as part of an organization. I don't think it works the same way. I don't think it emerges as a demand. I think it's too easy for others to project demands or their views on you. I think you have to be part of an organization to be part of it strategically. With that said, I think there are lots of different movement ways, movement types, community organizing, different types of community organizing. I think we're really thinking of this, at least we are, as kind of more like a jigsaw puzzle. We are not challenging people on their organizational structure. We do some challenging around race and gender, when their positions are not representative of race and gender. We of course do challenging on what core issues are versus surface issues. We talk about principal reduction as being a main thing that they're pushing for. We challenge on that. But our big thing is not the same as organizational structure, honestly. Organizational is not something we're trying to get into. We don't want to have that fight. If you are active and moving and involved, we think we can jigsaw puzzle enough pieces together that we can get this thing going. That could be completely wrong, but that's what we think we are right now. We just don't have the movement infrastructure to challenge individual organizations on their organizational structure, except to say that if you're not in an organization, you're not moving things right now. You could be moving things by accident, but that's not good enough. It's just not accurate enough. Okay, limited equity co-op. So this is not my area of specialty. This is the thing that I probably, again, know the least about. We have someone who just started working on this. Two things. One is just even the idea of equity still speaks to the idea of individual land ownership and seeing land as somehow somewhere we can profit off of. And I know there's different models where you only make like 4% a year or whatever. Even that's making 4% a year. I mean, this is a very new invention, the fact that you can make 4% a year off of land. This is something that has only come into human existence in the past couple of hundred years out of the many hundreds of years of human existence. And is just a very, very controlled version of the same. Fundamentally, it still has some relation to the same. I'm not against limited equity co-ops. I sort of don't know enough about them to say that. But I think we want to imagine the biggest things right now. I think if it ends up being that we fall back and we have a whole bunch of limited equity co-ops as our big victory at this time, we could probably do a lot worse. Probably wouldn't be such a bad thing. But we need to make sure that there's enough eventually that people don't have to plop down $20,000 to do that. The other thing is that, the other concern that we have in that area is that it still would allow them, even in the limited equity co-op, for there to be one group of people who have a lot of money, or of a limited equity co-op, or in a gated limited equity co-op community, who have no relation and don't want to have any relation to the other limited equity co-ops. So one of the things we were thinking about, for example, that we just toyed around with, is that, let's say we took over and we got control of, several blocks of city of one block. We'd say, okay, this is a community control thing. That means everybody, if we own this building, everybody, 5 blocks this way, 3 blocks that way, 2 blocks that way, everyone there controls this building. So that means everybody there gets a vote on what happens here. However, the people who live here, so they deserve more votes. So we may have a 2-tiered voting structure where everybody who's there gets 1 vote, everybody who lives here gets 3 votes, for example. So that could be one way of doing it. we wouldn't want is to set up something where you could create these isolated units where people just owned and controlled where they were, and that created for them to have really huge class divisions, and to create the want or the need to have these gated. I think that would exacerbate a tendency towards gated communities. I could be wrong about that. And again, the reality is we don't know enough about it. Those theories that we laid out about what could potentially happen with that, those are just ideas and theories. We just don't know nearly enough about it to determine that. In terms of completely alternative ways of thinking about it, we have looked at some of the things. We don't fully understand them yet. We're trying to send somebody there to Brazil and see what the MST does in Brazil. But they don't have limited co-ops. They take over a large piece of land, and everybody controls the land. We're trying to figure out what those mechanisms are and what is illegal. Is there a legal ownership of the land? We've heard both ways, but that's something we want to figure out. We don't think everything there would be applicable here, but we at least want to know what the range of things are so that we can figure that out. Okay, on the land as economics. So I think it's a very interesting question about the land and the economic system. It's something we go back and forth about a lot, and we don't have unanimity around. There's some people who really think that the economic question is fundamental, and others think that land. I think that land is fundamental. I think if we change land relationships, it would automatically change the economic system. So if land was completely decommodified, which is some of our objectives, some of us had to have that. If land is completely decommodified, then it eliminates an entire sector of the economy that just benefits off of trading, horse trading land. So the decommodification of land, I think, would be huge towards making housing available for people, creating enough food, producing enough food rather, and it would automatically reconstruct the economic system. I think it's very interesting to think about doing these land actions as a way of changing the economic system. In one way it is, but in other ways the land actions are changing the land relationships also. So it's just really, I think this is one of those things where it's going to be an interpretation of which is priority and which is secondary for groups. But I think we need to think out, and I don't know this, we need to think those out 3, 4, 5 steps down the road and see where they go. My guess is if there's a split somewhere, and then we'd have to play it out 3 or 4 steps down. Let's say we were going to change the economic system but not change the land system. What would that play out to? And what about vice versa? What would that play out to? We need to then play it out 3 or 4 or 5 steps and see which one actually makes the most sense. We have to, I don't know if we know how to do that, but we would need to work through that. But I do think that land relationships will change then. I mean, you can just imagine if air suddenly was commodified, our relationship to air would be completely different. If we decommodify land, I think we have a similar relationship. In terms of international, we got a lot of inspiration and information from other international organizations. MST was very influential. There's a group in India that I cannot think of the name of right now, but also that in South Africa, probably the ones that we were closely modeled after is Abagali in South Africa and the Western Cape Anti-Eviction Campaign, which are both huge, huge land reform organizations. Abagali is not so huge. I mean, Western Cape is not so huge, but Abagali could be one of the biggest land reform organizations in the world. And they do eviction defenses all day, all night. And so it's been very useful working with them. So we have strategic partnerships with both of them. We also have a strategic partnership we're trying to build one with an organization in Haiti, where I went a few months ago to talk about some of the work. It's just because of all the attacks that have been happening there lately on people who have been living in these tent cities that emerged after the earthquake. Then it's been very difficult to have to maintain a relationship there because they're under attack all the time. So we actually, when we think about what this society could look like, what land laws could look like, we don't look at any models in the U.S. We look at all models we have are outside of the U.S. Legal mobilization, we have a few legal organizations that we have relationships with. Center for Constitutional Rights, and we're just developing one now, the National Lawyers Guild. The biggest problem we have is not those relationships, but managing those relationships. When people need lawyers, someone's got to sit there, call the lawyers, find out. That's the biggest problem we have is we don't have staff to manage that problem. We've got lawyers who we think want to help, but we can't manage the lawyers. And the same thing with academics, by the way. The academics who want to help, we can't manage the relationship with academics.
Max,
No offense.
no offense taken at all, quite the opposite. Let me just say a couple of things quite quickly. let me remind you again, we're going to have a fundraiser for Take Back the Land on Friday at Slattery's, and that's where we're headed now. Slattery's is on 36th Street between 5th Avenue and Madison on the south side, and I hope that most of you will come here. Max, I just wanted to give you a chance to say one thing about really how you began, which was, you said, and it struck me, and I think it's exactly right, that things are so different now than 5 years ago. I mean, pretty much when you started. The level of optimism that you're exuding now is in place with what's happening on the ground, as opposed to 5 years ago when it was impossible to think about what the future would look like. Do you want to just have a finale actual statement on
So I think it's safe to say that 5 years ago, Take Back the Land was a fringe group that was doing work that very, very few other organizations, that only the fringe organizations were doing. And now the number of organizations that are either actively doing eviction defenses or land liberation is just immense. And they've had successful ones. The most successful group is City Life Vida Urbana in Boston. They've done a lot of them, and they have an incredible model in terms of working with their local groups, and they're part of Take Back the Land. They haven't moved to the point yet of developing these other demands besides just getting the family the new mortgage. But there's groups now in LA doing this, just all over the country. So it is absolutely amazing. And not just amazing just in terms of watching it happen, but also amazing in terms of what the implications are. So we are now, I think, with this open source model and with the number of organizations that are able to jump in, and the number of people who actually need no work of our own. We're not kicking people out of their homes so we can save them. People are getting kicked out of their homes by the good graces of capitalism. We're now in a position where we could move this thing reaching this critical mass. So we've talked about the critical mass in one shape or another, not as explicitly or as mechanically as we have here tonight. We just talked about in general that we need to do critical mass of takeovers. And people would be like, how do you have 5, 10, 15 organizations? How can you possibly do that? This is how we can possibly do it. So now all the stuff we're seeing out here, this is how we do it. And not we, right? I don't mean we in the small sense, I mean we in the movement sense. So I think this is extremely exciting in one sense. It's extremely scary in another sense, trying to figure out what happens. As bad as things are, we know the way they work. We don't know how they're going to work later, so it's a very scary thing to think that we are going to be participating in a time where we're not going to know what happens next, when we're always there. We don't know what the next thing is. But it's a very exciting thing to go through. The other thing that's interesting is talking to organizations who are doing this now, is that watching them struggle with the same things that we struggled with like 2 or 3 years ago. I have the exact same questions, which is reassuring in some way. So when I opened up for, I spoke at Occupy Baltimore, and they're having all kinds of internal things because they feel like they don't know what their demands are, and they don't know, they're just so confused about all kinds of things, which is, and like all their questions like this we all have. So I started saying that we did a Mojo Village, which we took over a piece of land and we built a shanty town. And there in Baltimore, they're really focused on building this land community, not just doing the actions, building this tent city. And so I said, I feel qualified to come and speak to you about what you're doing now, because Take Back the Land has been around since 2006, and we still don't have demands. So we haven't had demands. We haven't known what we're doing way longer than you haven't known. And that's kind of where I feel like now. Like I don't know what's happening next, but I know where they're about to step into. So I'm like one step further lost than everyone else is.
Max, thank you very much.